China has emerged as one of the 21st century's most consequential nations, making it more important than ever to understand how the country is governed. Welcome to Pekingology, the podcast that unpacks China's evolving political system. I'm Jude Blanchette, the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS, and this week I'm joined by Audrey Wong, Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Southern California, and Jean Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Today, we'll be discussing her recent article, Mobilizing Patriotic Consumers, China's New Strategy of Economic Coercion, which was recently published and co-authored in the Journal of Strategic Studies. Audrey, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Jude. Thanks. Great to be here.
First question, as I ask all guests, is a sense of your background, but particularly your intellectual trajectory. I'm curious how you first got interested in the topic of China, and then how you came to focus on, more broadly, the issue of Chinese economic statecraft.
Yeah, so on a personal note, I think I really got interested in studying China as someone who grew up in Singapore, where China is really a major player in the region, and we see it sort of dominating headlines and dominating public discourse and policy debates. From an intellectual perspective, I think what was most interesting about China's rise was not just about its military modernization, but how the Chinese government is thinking about gaining geopolitical influence short of using military force. And so that really, I think, got me studying as it grew economically, how it's trying to use that power both through carrots and sticks to shape how people perceive China and how elites and companies respond and sort of think about China's core interests.
What are the big questions that continue to motivate your work? Are there puzzles about China's behavior or China's economic statecraft that drive your research? And can you narrow these down? Are there sort of a few consistent themes or questions that run throughout your work?
Yeah, a lot of my work actually has focused on China's use of carrots. I'm working on a book manuscript that tries to challenge the conventional wisdom, I think, in Washington and many places, that just because China is a major economic power that's able to really throw its weight around and, buy over governments and buy over people to echo China's foreign policy preferences. So what I've done is to really sort of look at recipient countries and sort of how public accountability and domestic politics in these countries actually can shape and circumscribe China's ability to use its economic power. And we see, I think, often that the way that China offers, very subversive carrots, sort of under the table inducements, these tactics often actually incur a lot of public and political backlash, and that has a lot of reputational costs for China today.
I hope we can put a pin in that and come back to that issue, because it was one of the questions I wanted to ask you later about the costs incurred for China's stick approach of the carrot and stick mix. Before we dive into the article, which is great and incredibly helpful, I wanted to ask you just more broadly, maybe picking up on where your book is, to give listeners a sense of how you would describe China's economic statecraft more broadly. I think it's probably the case that if most people are asked about China as a global economic actor, they'll think of the sort of coercive, punitive, extractive side of it, very much the stick side. Is that the right way to think about it? Or is it much more evenly balanced or even more carrot balanced than we might think?
Yeah, I think we would have to really look at both. I think sticks are certainly something that China has used in the past and has been ramping up increasingly. But I do think that the carrots part of the picture is something that isn't really discussed as much as it should be. And I think part of it is because China is just present everywhere in terms of its extensive trade and investment ties with many countries. And I think that's actually could be potentially a more long-term, powerful way that China has been able to get countries to stay silent on human rights, on things that China cares about. And so I think that's actually sort of a longer term, perhaps more insidious way that China is gaining influence. And I think this has really shaped sort of how policymakers think about responding to issues in the South China Sea, about its willingness to meet with the Dalai Lama, about leaders' willingness to criticize China on its treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang.
The major framing of this article, the thing we're going to explore, is this idea of patriotic consumer mobilization. And so we're going to spend most of our time talking about this almost exclusively in the Chinese context. But before we get into that, could you give us a general sense of how consumer behavior intersects with politics more generally? Again, you talk about this to some extent in the article to try to clarify what you're talking about here. Certainly, China's not the only one where you see a phenomenon of consumers expressing their political views via the market. So how does China's behavior differ from others, or flip it the other way? How does sort of consumer engagement in politics in other countries differ from China?
Yeah, you're right that that's not a completely new trend or phenomenon. I think where China is different, or where China's use of nationalistic boycotts is different, is just, I think, fundamentally its scale and scope, right? I think China is quite unique in the lure of its consumer market. It's a major consumer market. Many companies are dependent on that market, or see the Chinese market as an important source of revenue and growth. And I think that lends China a lot of leverage in its ability to dangle the consumer market as a way to pressure companies and governments to fall in line. Second, I think, is the Chinese government's well-honed domestic propaganda apparatus. This is really an example where I think you see the use of this propaganda apparatus for foreign policy purposes. China is able to use its state media to really whip up nationalistic sentiment, to raise awareness about sort of offensive actions by foreign companies and governments, and get consumers on board to implement these nationalistic boycotts. And I think that is something that many other governments do not have the ability to do.
Last sort of level set question before we get into it is, what was the gap in the existing literature discussion that motivated you and your co-authors to write about this? Lots of other folks have been writing about Chinese economic coercion, or the quote unquote weaponization of China's market. My colleague Victor Cha here at CSIS has had a recent international security article about this. So where were the gaps that you saw that you felt you needed to address?
Yeah, I think it was really about thinking about the role of consumers as sort of a unit of action. I think a lot of times, both in US policy debates as well as in the academic scholarship, we see a lot of, most of the time, conceptualization of sanctions as something that's very formalized, that's implemented through regulatory measures, that's announced, explicitly by the coercing government. I think what we're seeing on China's part is a much more informal approach to economic coercion, where China often explicitly denies political motivations and often likes to call on the role of the grassroots, that this pressure is coming from the patriotic Chinese people, who are themselves the ones that are deciding to implement these boycotts. And hence, it's out of the hands of the Chinese government. And I think this is actually an interesting way, others such as Katian Zhang, who's a professor at George Mason, have written about this former approach to coercion, how that could allow China to avoid punishment through the WTO on these international trading mechanisms.
You've already basically answered my next question, but let me ask it anyway. What is sort of the main argument of this article? I think you've already indicated some of the pieces, looking at consumers as a sort of unit rather than looking at this in a more abstract way. But what else are some of the main arguments you make in the article?
I think we argue that patriotic consumer mobilization, I think, lends some coercive advantages. So the first is what I mentioned, which is manipulability, where it's easier to really shape the attitudes and actions of Chinese consumers. It's less costly for the Chinese economy, right? Because consumer goods are relatively substitutable. You can always redirect purchasing power to domestic companies or to other foreign companies. And so in that sense, China doesn't have to risk having to pressure firms who care about the bottom line, are less likely to want to disrupt their trading patterns and economic flows. So that means that China doesn't really have to worry about risking losing critical inputs for the Chinese economy. I think another interesting dimension of using nationalistic boycotts is the element of uncertainty. And what I mean by that is you're not always 100% sure what the scope or scale of these coercive actions are, right? Boycotts could start with one company, but it could easily escalate and expand, driven by nationalistic rhetoric, by nationalistic sentiment, right, to many other foreign companies. We've seen that happen, for example, in the case of Xinjiang, right, when many foreign companies, from H&M to Adidas, Nike to Burberry, were all targeted by a mix of state media induced boycotts, as well as sort of nationalistic consumers taking it into their own hands. And I think that lends an element of brinksmanship, right? Because if you see sort of empty storefronts, if you see angry protesters on the streets, right? I think that sends a very strong message to foreign companies that this is a force to be reckoned with. And I think it really adds an element of coercive power that I think an abstract legal regulatory measure doesn't really bring. And I think finally, then there's an element of plausible deniability where it's not quite clear what is state directed mobilization versus grassroots bottom up consumer mobilization. And I think that makes it harder for targeted companies and governments to respond effectively to these sorts of coercion because are you going to launch reciprocal boycotts? What sort of measures are you going to enact in response to that? That makes it harder for these targeted actors to respond. And I think it makes it easier for China to ease off coercion without having to explicitly announce, oh, we're sort of acknowledging that this didn't really work and now we're sort of backing down. So I think this helps the Chinese government to save face and sort of maintain some flexibility in its actions.
Is there a representative case study for you that you could just explain, just to give listeners a sense of what does this look like in practice, right? So, or is there an archetype that you think of where what is the initial offense that a third country engages in? And then what does this look like as it builds? What is the trigger point? How does the PRC mobilize? What are some of the messages that they use to mobilize it? Could you just give us an illustrative example?
Yeah, so the main case we look at in this paper is the case of South Korea and the THAAD issues. That is a US-led missile defense system that the South Korean government agreed to deploy. This, of course, incurred the wrath of the Chinese government and the Chinese people. And so this happened in the 2016-2017 period. And so Lotte is a South Korean department chain with many stores in China that was often a target of these nationalistic boycotts. The Chinese government was really unhappy with Lotte because it agreed to a land swap agreement in which that missile defense and these batteries would be deployed on land that was owned by the South Korean company. So we see the Chinese government implement a mix of both regulatory actions and nationalistic boycotts against Lotte, where on the regulatory side, the Chinese government announced fire safety inspections for these department stores, saying like, oh, you have violated the code and these stores need to be shut. At the same time, we see public demonstrations by Chinese citizens outside these department stores, holding up banners that said, Lotte supporting THAAD, get out of China now. Sort of really visible displays of public dissatisfaction and nationalistic sentiment on the ground. And Lotte wasn't the only company targeted. We also see K-pop concerts being canceled, South Korean celebrities not being able to travel to China for their scheduled performances. At the same time, we also see the Chinese government issuing directives, right, ordering group travel agencies to cancel planned travel to South Korea. So we see a huge array of both boycott and regulatory actions over South Korea's deployment of a US-led missile defense system. And if you look at media rhetoric online, you can identify 4 indicators of sort of this rallying of nationalistic sentiment. First and foremost, sort of harking back to common themes in Chinese propaganda, really the incitement of themes of foreign humiliation, of national humiliation, that China is really being exploited by South Korea and foreign powers. And Chinese state media saying that boycotts are a way for Chinese citizens to express their patriotism, to really demonstrate their love for their country. And we also see an element of signaling where in both Chinese language and English language articles published by Chinese state media, we see sort of an explicit desire to tell foreign audiences, look, this is what South Korea and Lotte are doing. China wants to send a message that if you offend us, your access to the Chinese market will be in danger.
Some of the actions like using measures to slow down or impede Chinese tourists going to South Korea don't require that the consumers share Beijing's view or have particularly nationalist sentiment. Some of them, though, to get people to go on the streets and protest likely require that the consumers share at least a basic nationalist orientation such that they're willing to get up off the couch and go. Do you have any sense on, is this successful? Is Beijing able to mobilize because vast swaths of the Chinese public already hold negative opinions about Japan or Taiwan or South Korea and thus can fairly easily be triggered to protest? Or is there a lot of shaping that has to go on by Beijing to sort of get people out into the streets?
I would say there's a fundamental level of nationalism that makes Chinese consumers more easily mobilized. But I think there's also very active shaping to get actual consumer action because we see these nationalistic boycotts not being applied, just to Japan, for example, right, which is a classic case of very strong sort of anti-Japanese nationalism present in China. But South Korea is a different case where I think most Chinese consumers actually have very positive perceptions of South Korea. K-pop is highly popular. South Korean cosmetics are highly popular products in China. So I think in this case and in many other instances, the Chinese state is actually actively trying to shape, narratives of foreign humiliation and trying to put South Korea right in the bucket of, oh, this is another example of foreign powers trying to exploit Chinese interests, trying to take advantage of the Chinese economy without respecting China's sovereignty and Chinese preferences.
On that, can you talk a bit about the types of issues that motivate China to launch a patriotic consumer mobilization effort? I mean, some of the ones we've just talked about are Japan, which obviously is mostly about territorial disputes like Senkaku Islands, THAAD, which of course nominally was about the US and South Korea placing missile battery that could potentially see into and operate in China. Are there other issues that you're seeing, and especially any new emergent issues where you're seeing China willing to mobilize Chinese consumers to send punitive signals?
Yeah, I think certainly the territorial disputes and core interests are issues that the Chinese government is certainly likely to mobilize consumers on. I think we're increasingly seeing the use of consumer boycotts and I think just economic coercion and statecraft in general, right, as a way to inhibit foreign criticism over human rights issues, over the extralegal detention of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And so I think there's an expansion, right, just from these hard security issues to really anything that could be seen as critical of the Chinese Communist Party. At the same time, I think that's really wrapped up in core interests such as Taiwan, right? It's getting foreign companies to acknowledge Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, or at very least to remain silent or implicitly acknowledge that Taiwan is not seen by China as an independent entity. And I think a lot of times we see what's interesting is that I think patriotic consumer mobilization is a way for China to incite nationalistic sentiment on these very sensitive issues, but not targeting Taiwan directly, but targeting third-party actions and third-party companies, right, who are seen as offending Chinese sensibilities over these issues. And so we see many examples of nationalistic criticism or nationalistic sentiment being incited against, Marriott, against Delta, against U.S. airlines, against foreign luxury brands who inadvertently printed a T-shirt, right, with a map of China that doesn't include the South China Sea or Taiwan, for example. And I think this is a way for China to channel domestic nationalism in ways that really serve the Chinese government's foreign policy interests, really underscoring the CCP as a resolute defender of China's national sovereignty, but without risking escalation or too many calls for direct military action against Taiwan, because again, these actions are targeted at foreign companies who are not directly involved in a Taiwan contingency.
I wanted to ask about the issue of deniability and try to understand that a bit more, because some of this, I mean, I was living in China during the THAAD incident. I was living in China during the 2012 Senkaku Island and then subsequent protests against Japanese businesses in Beijing where rocks were being thrown through windows. There was not much plausible deniability at the time. So it struck me at the time that it wasn't that they were deniable. It's just that, as you said earlier, we have no corresponding set of tools that we can use in response. So I just wanted to ask for you to pick on that thread a little bit more. Am I wrong in thinking that it's not so much that it's deniable? I mean, it is ostensibly deniable, but it's not the sort of issue where folks are scratching their heads about, well, why are all these Chinese consumers suddenly out in the streets? Everyone seems to know that this is a state mobilized effort. But it did strike me that, especially for Western market democracies, as you said earlier in the podcast, what do you do about this? Do you try to launch a corresponding boycott in Seoul or in Poughkeepsie, New York? Can you do what China did to Latte Group? Can you just weaponize health inspection and fire inspections and essentially shut down Chinese businesses? You can't. So just your thoughts on that. Am I misunderstanding what you mean by deniability?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think there's some tension there where I think there's some plausible deniability, even though we all know that oftentimes there is state involvement in getting people to protest on the ground and sort of controlling the amount of nationalistic sentiment that occurs online. I think there's still an element of deniability because the Swedish National China Center had a report a couple of years ago trying to catalog the number of instances of these nationalistic boycotts. And they found about 90 in the last 15 years or so. And actually, the vast majority of them didn't really have explicit or overt evidence of state involvement. And I think that's sort of the power of these nationalistic boycotts, where sure, we see in some instances against Japan, against THAAD, against H&M over Xinjiang, right? We see a clear trail. There's a state media article, a post on Weibo saying, here, look at this company. It's really offending China. We need to take action. But then there are many other instances where Chinese consumers take it on themselves to incite these boycotts and call for boycotts of these foreign products. And so in that respect, I think that's sort of the power where companies are seeing, okay, so we know maybe China wanted to only target Latte or target H&M, but then we see that expanding to Adidas, to Nike, to Burberry, to a range of other foreign companies that Chinese consumers took it upon themselves to dig up and collate a list of these companies. And so I think that's the double-edged sword of Chinese nationalism, right? That the government can control it to some extent, but I think where it becomes very powerful as a coercive tool is that this could spiral out of control. And that's something that companies are really scared of.
I want to spend maybe the next and last section of the conversation trying to get your sense on efficacy of some of these measures. This is one where there's a growing literature of how effective, more broadly, China's coercive strategy is. And there's mixed results. I think CSIS did some work that I was not involved in that basically came to the conclusion that China's economic coercion strategy is unsuccessful. I have my own quibbles with that, which I'm happy to talk about. But just curious, as you look at this, how do you think about bang for buck for Beijing in using state-directed patriotic consumer mobilization as a tool to shape bilateral or third country behavior or company behavior as well? Does this work?
Yeah, that's a really good question and one that I've been thinking a lot about. I think it also depends partly on how you define effectiveness or success, right? So, first, I think you could divide into economic versus political. So, I think economically, if the Chinese government does identify certain companies to target, like those companies have ultimately sort of withdrawn from the Chinese market. Lotte sort of closed many of its stores. H&M also suffered significantly in terms of revenue losses and retail presence in China. So I think the coercive power of these nationalistic boycotts, I think, is really prominent, especially when it's coupled with overt regulatory measures that are implemented at the same time by the Chinese government. So I think if a company is targeted by these boycotts and the energies are focused on that by the Chinese government, right, I think the economic cost can be quite substantial. If you're looking at the political dimension, I think the picture is much more mixed. Take going back to the South Korea example, if the ultimate goal for the Chinese government was to get a policy change to get South Korea to retract its decision, right, that certainly did not work, right? The successive administrations, both progressive and conservative, have sort of continued with deployment of that. And I think, in fact, the most recent president, right, is very keen on strengthening the U.S. alliance. And I think nationalistic boycotts in the South Korea case really, I think, led to a lot of backlash. I think it opened the eyes of the South Korean public about the coercive power of the Chinese government and the Chinese economy. And if you look at recent polls, sort of the public views of China have become much more negative, and in some cases, even more negative than views of Japan, which is very high bar. And so in that sense, I think you were really seeing sort of some of the negative spillover effects of harnessing these nationalistic boycotts. On the other hand, I do think these boycotts have very powerful psychological deterrent effects where, this is now on the radar of many foreign companies who are concerned about their bottom lines being impacted and how they can avoid the situations. We've seen scattered examples of companies preemptively self-censoring out of fear of being targeted by the Chinese government. Muji, a Japanese company, was a very interesting example where during the uproar over Xinjiang, actually openly announced that it was probably using Xinjiang cotton as a way to appeal to Chinese consumers. So I think the Chinese government may not be that effective at achieving immediate policy changes on the targeted governments, but I think companies are a much lower bar. Many companies have often apologized for offending the Chinese people, not all of them, but a significant number. And I think they're often factoring that into their business decisions as well as their interactions with their own home governments. I think Germany is one prominent example where, you have German automakers very dependent on the Chinese market, and you have the Mercedes-Benz CEO coming out and saying, no, we're not supportive of the EU anti-subsidy probe into Chinese EVs. And that's clearly traced to concerns over losing access to the Chinese consumer market.
That last piece strikes me as the one where it's difficult to measure effectiveness or efficacy because part of this is how it shapes calculations of decisions that have yet to be made or will be made differently from how they would have absent the visible demonstration of Chinese state and market power. So there are instances that I know of where third countries, because they have seen targeting of Japan or Korea, don't do certain things that they otherwise would have done, but that doesn't show up in any observable data. And like with companies, the cost of some of these measures is actually greater than China understands because instead of the company putting a marginal dollar into the Chinese marketplace, it will put it somewhere elsewhere. But on the other hand, companies like the Muji instance, they're companies who snap into line or go back and lobby their home governments to be nicer to China because they have significant interest in China. So it just strikes me this is a hard one to say conclusively, like exactly what the effectiveness is, because there's multiple domains, multiple audiences. Not all the real audience is the targeted country. I think in many ways it's like kill the chicken to scare the monkey. So I'm always just wary when, which you didn't do, you had a very nuanced take on this of on the one hand, on the other. Strikes me as about really the right way to do this because it really depends.
Yeah, and if I can just add one thing, I think the Chinese government also really cares about what foreign actors say about China. I think oftentimes silence is an important sort of outcome for China, right? So even if you're not able to get the United States government to reverse its policy on Taiwan, right, but you're able to get U.S. companies to stay silent on the issue, to tacitly avoid the issue, acknowledge Chinese sovereignty, I think that is a goal that the CCP has and is happy to achieve.
Final question, and this is speculative, and I don't know as a financer, but would appreciate if you took a stab, even in the context of I don't know. In an era of likely prolonged, slower growth, where China may, at the margin, have an incentive to try to woo foreign companies back into the market. This week, we're recording this on March 29th. Just a few days ago, a group of US CEOs were in China. Do you think at the margin, China's use of patriotic consumer mobilization will increase or decrease in a lower growth environment?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. I would say that I think on the one hand, I think if there's slower growth and if companies are able to find, other alternative markets and alternative sources of growth in Southeast Asia or other developing economies, right, then I think you could argue that there's decreased dependence on the Chinese market, there's greater diversification. And so sort of companies will be less beholden and less concerned about patriotic consumer mobilization. On the other hand, I think perhaps more pessimistically, I think it depends on how slow the growth is, right? I think growth is slowing, but if China is still sort of a major economy that's here to stay and those sources of revenue can't be found or replaced adequately elsewhere, I think that could actually make companies even more beholden and even more concerned and wanting to hold on, right, to whatever they can in the Chinese market. And I think that would sort of continue the coercive power of using nationalistic boycotts.
But do you think China might be more hesitant in a lower growth environment to launch a patriotic mobilization campaign because it worries that it needs all the positive company sentiment? Or do you think it's not making that calculation? And if Japan or South Korea or the United States, if it has a way to use market power to punish one of these countries for a perceived slight, that it'll do it irrespective of what the growth rate is?
Yeah, I think I would agree with you that I think it would make the Chinese government more cautious about using these coercive tools. I mean, I think sort of you look at interplay between economic coercion, economic inducement, right? If you're using coercion too often, you're going to decrease the allure of the Chinese market. You're going to make both companies and governments more wary of getting too dependent on the Chinese economy, right? And so that's going to create a cycle, right, where foreign companies and governments try to diversify away from the market. And I think to the extent that economic growth and stability is still an important part of performance legitimacy for the CCP, that I think in the last couple of years is probably seen is trying to stabilize the relationship to some extent with the United States. And I think it sees some merit certainly to attracting foreign companies and getting them to remain invested in the market. And so I think we could see a concerted effort to shift back to inducements over explicit use of boycotts.
Well, Audrey, I want to thank you for, first of all, writing such a fantastic paper with your co-authors. And I've just long admired your work, and especially on just a topic which is becoming only more important, Chinese economic statecraft. So thanks for the paper. Thanks for your work. And most importantly, thank you for taking the last 49 minutes out of a busy day to talk with us.
Thanks so much, Jude, for having me. It was a great conversation, and long enjoyed listening to Picking-ology. So it's a privilege to be here.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog